Okay, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Greetings, everyone. My name is Brandon Kyle. I am the Director of Alumni and Family Engagement here at Pitzer College, and I'd like to welcome you to our live book club discussion. After launching our Alumni and Family Book Club back in September, we've grown our membership to over 250 subscribers in the past 6 months and are incredibly grateful to have been able to connect with readers from within the Pitzer community from literally all across the world. If you haven't already joined, please do so. We'll be voting on our summer selection very soon. So this afternoon, we'll be discussing our latest feature, Black Wealth, White Wealth, co-authored by our very own Pitzer College President, Melvin Oliver, and Brandeis University Professor Thomas Shapiro. I have the honor of moderating this discussion, and we'll be asking a variety of questions about the book, and some of which are coming directly from our readers. So, first published in 1995, Black Wealth, White Wealth changed the national conversation about long-term financial impact of systemic racism in America. During this talk, President Oliver and Professor Shapiro will discuss how to better understand and better address the racial gap in the US, where a typical white family has nearly 10 times more wealth than a typical Black family. Just to provide a little bit of background before we get started, about our authors. President Oliver, as many of us well know, is a nationally recognized leader in higher education, an acclaimed professor of sociology, and an expert on racial inequality. Prior to becoming president of Pitzer in 2016, President Oliver was the executive dean at UC Santa Barbara's College of Letters and Science. He also served as the vice president of the Ford Foundation's Asset Building and Community Development Program and co-director of UCLA's Center for the Study of Urban Poverty. Professor Thomas Shapiro is the David R. Pocrus Professor of Law and Social Policy at Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University. An expert in racial inequality, public policy, and asset development. His courses include Wealth and Poverty and Theory on Social Policy and Change. Shapiro is the author of The Hidden Cost of Being African American, How Wealth Perpetuates Inequality. Without further ado, I would like to welcome both President Oliver and Professor Shapiro to our live discussion this afternoon. Welcome, gentlemen, and thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Absolutely. So one of the glowing reviews of your book asserted, and I quote, Black Wealth, White Wealth continues to inform and inspire social policy advocates with its breakthrough approach to racial inequality. That was from Angela Glover Blackwell, founder and CEO of PolicyLink, who is also, I might add, a trustee and friend of the college. All these years later, clearly this statement still holds truth today. What were your initial thoughts when you learned that your work had been cited by author Ta-Nehisi Coates in his article, The Case for Reparations, and even most recently in the 6-part series, George Floyd's America? Were you inspired and motivated or somewhat concerned that we still have some work to do in combating the racial wealth gap?
Well, that's a pretty good question, but whenever I hear the question, am I surprised about issues of race being in the forefront? I'm not surprised. This has been the Achilles heel of America since its founding, and it is a very difficult problem, and it's a problem that is not going to be solved in an easy way. And so I'm never surprised that this is a issue that is before us. Again, I am pleased that we're talking about this in the way we are right now. This seems to be an important period for discussion about race, and especially for the African American legacy in America. So I'm pleased about that, but I'm never surprised that this is a topic of conversation.
Yeah, I would add that I'm not surprised, but I'm also somewhat heartened that we're in one of those all too rare moments, I believe, in the history of the United States where some of this work and concern and challenges bubbles up a bit more than it usually has. And I think in this period, with what's going on now, the racial reckoning congruent with the pandemic and the the trial around the murder of George Floyd underway this week, that all kinds of conversations are back on the table. And I'm just really pleased that that our work has been able to add to I think, a better direction for that conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So take us back to the early 90s. How has racial economic inequality being discussed then? How was it being discussed then? And why do you think our understanding of it needed to be changed?
Well, if you remember the early 90s, it was dominated by a perception that there was a growing part of the African American community that was becoming increasingly detached from economic opportunity, called the urban underclass, and described most cogently in William Julius Wilson's The Truly Disadvantaged. This was a group that was characterized by a whole set of behaviors, from out of wedlock births to being a high single family household, high rates of low education, high rates of criminal activity. And they were concentrated, perceived to be concentrated in communities where poverty was dominant. 40% or more of the people were poor. And Wilson had argued that there were structural reasons for those structural reasons had to do with changes in the American economy, movement from goods and services, from industrial production. And it wasn't racial in intent, but it had a racialized outcome. He made the argument that this was a class issue now, that African Americans who had opportunity for education, they were moving forward, they were joining the middle class, they no longer had the barriers associated with race. It was mainly those people who were captured in these concentrated communities of poverty. Well, that didn't sit quite well with me when I was thinking about those problems, because I had a sense that those communities were not accidental. That is, those people were in those communities because of a long set of historical circumstances, and we had to unpack that. And if you unpack that, you find a very strong racial component. And that was the narrative that I was interested in trying to introduce as a kind of a new perspective on this. And in order to do that, it means you just can't look at those on the bottom. You have to look at the whole spectrum. And we came across wealth in a funny way, and it's a personal story. So I'll give it to the 200 close friends on the call here. I was a new assistant professor at UCLA, and I was in a period in which I could not afford a house. And UCLA had a new housing program, and I applied for it, and they were going to give you a down payment. And I was told that I didn't qualify for it. And I said, well, what's the qualifications? And they said, well, you have to be central to our plans. And as a professor of African American studies, I guess I wasn't central to their plans. I saw another guy who applied for the same program. He was in the same department as I was in. And he said, Melvin, did you get the loan? And I said, no, I didn't. He said, I got the loan. I said, that's interesting. And he said, and you know the interesting thing about it? I don't need it. My uncle died and just left me this money, and I can afford a house now without it, but I'll take it. And that got me to thinking about the difference. Here we are, we have the same education, we have the same job, we get the same pay, but yet he had a resource that I did not have available to me. And that resource was wealth or assets. And that started me on the journey of thinking about how assets and long-term intergenerational mobility works together.
First of all, thank you for sharing that. You talk a little bit about your journey. How did the two of you actually meet? How did you decide to co-author this book?
I'll let Tom.
It's a story that probably has many sides. Let me start. We had the good fortune of being fellow graduate students together in a sociology department at Washington University in St. Louis. And actually, I was a few years ahead of Melvin. He's so much younger than I am that he was a couple of years behind me. And we became friends over the basketball court, and we became friends over a little bit of social life, and certainly over the intellectual curiosity that we shared and continue to share many years later around race and
the dissertation writing group.
Yeah, yes, and we were in a dissertation kick-ass writing group together, trying to push and nudge each other. And I think Melvin actually finished a little before I did, and we went off to different parts of the country from St. Louis. But it's also that when Melvin left St. Louis, he went to Los Angeles, and I came to Boston. And Melvin had the opportunity, which he took, to get associated and friendly with my family, who lived in Los Angeles. And so we would visit every time I would visit my family, and we would continue our conversations until I don't know if I can put a date on it, but it was sometime in the mid 1980s, and that will date me for sure, where we ran across an item that said, for the first time in American social science history, there was a good data set on family assets and liabilities. And our brains just went crazy in thinking about all the possibilities of using wealth as a way to crack open a window to the past and see what that intergenerational mobility was attached to wealth, what could be moved forward and what couldn't be moved forward, and all of the issues that then became part of Black Wealth, White Wealth for us.
So just to dive a little bit deeper, how did Black Wealth, White Wealth change the dominant understanding of the racial wealth gap? The subhead is a new perspective on racial inequality. What was that new perspective, and how did the book enable us to look at wealth as an indicator of inequality?
Well, I always like to say that Black Wealth, White Wealth changed our gestalt of understanding. You know how you look at that photograph and you see one thing in it, but then if you kind of blurry your eyes, you look at it again and you see another thing. Wealth allows us to look at the inequality, racial inequality in different ways. And the example I always like to use is the example of income, family income. If you look at family income, it's around 83 cents. African Americans have about 83 cents for every dollar that whites have. But if you change that to wealth and you look at the median wealth, Blacks have about 10 cents for every dollar. Now that really changes your sense of the depth and pervasiveness of inequality when you move to wealth. And it's a whole different perspective. Wealth is a stock. It's a resource you store, you save it. Income is a flow. It comes into your possession and you use it to provide for your lifestyle. What do you use wealth for? You use it to secure your life chances, to get an education, to get better health, to start a business. Wealth is what you use to navigate and secure upward mobility. And wealth is not like income. Income you get for a period of time, a weekly income, a monthly income. Wealth, you accumulate it. You don't just accumulate it over your lifetime, you accumulate it over generations. It's really dependent on the success of previous generations and how much wealth you have. It has that historical component. So when you move the lens to wealth, you see the racial economic divide in America as largely a function of this racial wealth gap. And that really opens up new vistas for historical and contemporary scholarship, as well as a whole new set of policy options.
You've mentioned this a little bit here, and also both of you have mentioned this in the book. You said that the racial wealth gap, to understand it, we have to look at the historical legacy as well as the contemporary issues. Could you talk a little bit more about the history of this country as a part of how you describe the sedimentation of inequality?
Well, the key to really getting the most out of Black wealth, white wealth, is understanding that wealth is constructed, it's structured over the many generations through a lot of different mechanisms. And you can look at the mechanisms over a historical time period in different eras: slavery, Jim Crow, de jure segregation, the period of institutionalized racism, and I would say now this period of systemic racism. And in each one, you see various mechanisms. In slavery, there's no accumulation. Slaves were the property. They were the asset. In the 1840s, slaves constituted over half of the net worth of the Southern slaveholder. And they used it the same way I've been talking about it, to create mobility, to buy land, to secure education for their kids and their children, to start businesses, to invest, especially North, okay? So after the Civil War, when slaves were taken away from folks and you thought, oh my God, they're gonna go broke. 30 years later, they had the same amount of wealth as they had when they had slaves. Why? Because they had all those benefits from the wealth holding they had during slavery. If you move to Reconstruction, the promise of Reconstruction was what W.B. Du Bois thought was the greatest opportunity America had to become a true democracy. But that was a failure, right? And it was a failure in part because they were never able to come through on that promise of 40 acres and a mule. 40 acres, land, wealth, an asset, an intergenerational asset. Nevertheless, about a quarter of Black farmers by 1900 had ownership of their farms. So imagine if that could have really worked. Reconstruction, it was another story. People don't realize it, but slaves came out of slavery with a whole set of abilities and skills that could have been quite marketable. They were the people who built the houses. They were the brick masons. They were the people who were the barbers and the cooks. They could have had a strong foothold in the urban economy of the South. Instead, Jim Crow took those opportunities away and they weren't able to use them. The most important thing I think that happened during that period was that Blacks took what historians have called an economic detour. Usually when groups are blocked from mobility through the professions, they go to entrepreneurship. So Blacks did move toward our entrepreneurship, but they had multiple barriers faced in front of them that really limited their success. And the big barriers were that Jim Crow laws really took away 80% of the market. If you could not have commerce with whites, the only people you could have commerce with were Blacks. So they had 80% of the market where they could not apply their trade. And so what you had was the development of Black businesses in places like Durham, the insurance capital of Black America, which is still the shining example. but then others that are no longer there. Black Wall Street in Tulsa, the Wilmington, North Carolina business corridor. Those places were destroyed by violence. The threat of competition from African-American businesses was met with violence. And we are just excavating all of those, the Rosewood Floridas, places we don't know because they don't exist anymore. And the folks who live there have just gone, and the memory is not there. But that economic detour means that Blacks, unlike most immigrants, did not have that entrepreneurial legacy to count on and to build on and to create the next generation of professions once desegregation came. And finally, the legacy of the New Deal. The New Deal was an amazing opportunity in America for working class people to secure assets through home ownership. For the first time, the federal government guaranteed loans, allowed low down payments and long-term interest rates. So it actually was cheaper, imagine this, cheaper to buy a house than to rent a house in most urban areas. So there was no economic barrier to home ownership. But African Americans were not able to secure FHA loans because of redlining, drawing the circle around communities and saying no loans in those communities, agreeing to restrictive covenants, which made it impossible for Blacks to buy homes that had covenants associated with racial designations. And that was the generation that created the largest wealth for the average American of any generation we've ever had. So those are some of the things that historically have done that. And as we talk about in the book, what that did was, it's the past, but it has a living effect on the present. Wealth captures, I think, the historical effect of a combination of low wages, personal and organizational discrimination, and institutionalized racism. And when you see that generation after generation, that kind of economic insecurity, it leads to what I call sedimentation. The sediment flows to the bottom. And so Blacks become on the bottom of the social structure, not because of personal failure, but because of systematic barriers. So that to me is the real powerful story, historical story in Black wealth, white wealth. I'm going to stop because I keep going. Sorry.
No, it's a great capture. I would weave in just a short item or two, that while all of these very tough and tall barriers are being presented for African American advancement in the United States and in those communities that Melvin mentioned, like Tulsa and Wilmington and Rosewood and Helena, Arkansas, and others, where they were successful, enterprising African American middle class communities with businesses and professionals. Those were literally wiped out at the brunt of white mobs that took over the land and the property, and got rid of whatever competition might have been felt. The item that I would weave in there is that while all of that is happening, and gosh, that's enough, right, to explain an awful lot, there's a central part of federal government policy in the United States that facilitates the generation and growth of wealth, mostly for white middle class groups. And one of those, or for them to become middle class, and we can just point to, for example, the Homestead Acts, just before and just after the Civil War, that literally provided land ownership if a family could prove that they could make a living off of that land and they had built a shelter. And we will put on the table, probably not for discussion today, that was Native American land for the most part. And that's a whole different but very much related story. And then so that accounts for the beginning of land ownership and home ownership for a relatively large swath of white Americans who begin to acquire wealth then over the generations, and they can pass it down. And the other part I would add to the story that Melvin was telling around the New Deal is that while that redlining is going on, the Federal Housing Administration, that sets up a market that creates wealth for the homeowners. And we can trace that to redlining. We can trace the exclusion to African Americans to redlining and restrictive covenants and all the nefarious stuff that was going on. Today, one of the legacies is that the broad 2/3, from the 20th to the 80th percentile of American families, 2/3 of their wealth is in home ownership. It's not in stocks and bonds. It's not the saving of money, although that's obviously very important. But it's an institutional, market-regulated mechanism created by the government that largely benefits white families.
You make the point again and again, and I think it's an excellent one, that the past is not the past. You talk about legacy of slavery, Reconstructionism, Tulsa draw a line to recent day policies and practices like redlining you mentioned here. How have contemporary policies continued to feed the racial wealth gap in America?
Well, if you look at housing, which Tom just pointed out, and that's the largest component of most family wealth in the US, that is continued to be a set of barriers for African Americans, starting with the denial of loans at a higher rate, discrimination in terms of home assessments. I've now sold about four homes. And after my second home, I learned something. I learned that I am not present when they come to assess the value of my home. Because if I am there and they identify this home as being a home that an African American lives, it will be assessed at a lower price than the equivalent home. I take down family photos that identify Black people as being a part of the house. Because if that home isn't appraised at a certain price, it cannot be sold at that price. That happens. Insurance redlining. Obviously, we saw that African Americans were targeted for subprime loans. So we had the interesting map. If you took the map from the 40s that showed where redlining occurred, if you looked at it in 2008, that's where the concentration of homes that are subprime were targeted. African Americans were targeted for subprime loans. And a middle-class African American is more likely to live in a community that has concentrated poverty than a poor white person. So Blacks share less in the benefits of homeownership all the way around. And I know Tom would be upset with me if I didn't mention the home mortgage deduction, which goes disproportionately to whites. So Blacks continue to have vastly unequal equity for the same amount of home that they buy. So this continues. One of the books, I love to give recommendations for books. So this is my newest recommendation for you. Dorothy Brown, a law professor at Emory University, has an interesting book called The Whiteness of Wealth. It came out about a month ago. She had an article in the New York Times. It shows how tax policy and the IRS regulations have overwhelmingly benefited whites over Blacks from such things as the marriage penalty. If you are a family in which both the husband and wife works and the wife makes more than the husband, which happens in a lot of Black families because of various factors, you pay more taxes than a home in which the one person works and the other person doesn't work, or both of you have equal incomes. And that disproportionately affects Blacks. A whole series of tax laws she uncovers, from the home mortgage and interest deduction to pension policy. It's color coded. So even today, we find these kinds of mechanisms that have that kind of disparate impact.
We might have to add that to the book club. My goodness. So you both are sociologists who turn theory into scholarship, into action particularly. To note just a couple of those examples, President Oliver, as I mentioned earlier, you served as the vice president of Ford Foundation's Asset Building and Community Development Program for about 8 years. Professor Shapiro, you served as the director of Brandeis University's Institute of Assets and Social Policy until last year. You both have been honored as asset building champions by the Center for Global Policy. But first, let's talk a little bit more about assets. Can you describe the field of assets development?
Tom, let me try to do this, and then I'm going to let you talk a little bit more
Take
about
the first shot.
Yeah, about what you do on that side of the lane. But they call me really the father. I won't say the father of asset development is a guy named Michael Sherrodden, who really did develop the notion of assets. And then we did our work, and right as Black Wealth, White Wealth was being published, I was offered the vice presidency of the Ford Foundation in the area of poverty reduction. And I was given the opportunity, carte blanche. I was told, you figure out what you want to do, we'll support you. And they had no idea what I wanted to do. And I came in and I said, okay, poverty reduction. I am frustrated. Everything here is oriented around, some imaginary line. We know what it is, the poverty line, moving people above it. And each recession, people fall below it, and you continue moving back above it, and then they fall below it, and you move above it. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. I wanted to use the notions of assets and asset development to focus on intergenerational mobility. How do you generate assets that are intergenerational, that help people permanently move out of poverty? Because I've talked about this. Assets are what you use to plan for mobility, education, access, business, health, land. And for many people in the world, land is an environmental resource. It's not only owning land, it's making sure that land can produce and that it stays fertile and it is taken care of, your stewardship. And so I went to the Ford Foundation. I told my staff, I said, we want to try to think about how we build assets for people and how they can use those to generate mobility. And we came up with a whole set of assets, from financial assets to social capital assets to environmental assets. And we tried to think about, how do we take policy and help people build them, help people protect them, and help people preserve and use them over time to create social mobility. And that was such a total revolution for the poverty reduction field. They didn't know what hit them. And so it was something that everyone was trying to say, what do you mean by this? How do we do that? And I worked there 8 years, And I left in part because after about 6, people had gotten it. And I no longer had to do the hard work because people kind of saw the relevance of it. And we were doing research that was trying to understand it better. We were training scholars, especially diverse scholars in the area, to take up the topic. We were doing demonstration programs, self-help home loan program, programs for individual development accounts, children development accounts. We were funding policy in NGOs, such as TOMS. We had initiatives for closing the racial wealth gap. So I felt like this is now on its way, and it has been a very fruitful area for the past 20, 25 years. I think Tom can tell you a little bit more on the policy front and what's on the ground.
Great. I have spent much of the last several decades working around racial wealth inequality, and trying to bridge from the academy to advocacy and to constituency-based groups that might help change policy and sustain it in the long run. Very soon after Black Wealth, White Wealth was published, I kind of took on the challenge of trying to drive the empirical understanding of what racial wealth inequality looked like, not just the number of a dime on a dollar, but to make that a part of the narrative in the public square, but also to understand how we got to that point, the historical understanding, the contemporary drivers like home equity, like one we've not touched on yet today, student debt, and its relationship to wealth extraction, particularly among African American student borrowers. So I took those challenges on, and I think, like Melvin, at a certain point, and I can't put a date on it, I felt that there were enough people in the field that had been attracted to the passion and the academics around racial wealth inequality that I was able to move on and to try and dig deeper into what were the short-term and long-range drivers of that, and what policy mechanisms might we have. And I suspect we want to talk about some solutions before our hour is up. And I don't want to necessarily overly foreshadow that at the moment. However, I do think the whole area of understanding and creating a racial wealth equity for policy, and simply ask the question, what does this policy do what's its consequence for racial wealth inequality in the United States? And take that as a guide. And once we do that, I think we're smart enough now, not as smart as we'll ever be, but we're smart enough to be able to design and implement policies that move towards that goalpost. Not that they'll be perfect, but it's the direction that's really most important here.
Yeah. President Oliver, you talked a little bit about this earlier, the importance of home ownership as a part of the conversation of creating a wealth equity. One of the main programs that you were working on at the Ford Foundation, including the sort of structure and securement of home mortgages for 35,000 low wealth households. Could you tell us a little bit more about that program, how you oversaw it, how you managed it to success?
Yeah, this was a demonstration program.
Mm-hmm.
At the time when we started the assets program, there was a group of economists who were very critical of our approach. They saw home ownership as very risky for people who don't have strong incomes, who might be subject to periodic job loss, who are socially vulnerable. So their argument was, yes, it's good for the middle class, but it's not good for people who, you know, are precarious economically. Well, we were precisely wanting those people because we want those people to get assets just like everyone else. We don't want them to be dependent on transfers. We want them to build assets that they have control over, that they can use for their own and their children's mobility. So there's a wonderful group in North Carolina called Self-Help. At the time, I think it was Community Self-Help. Now they're not called Self-Help. Self-Help had been running their own community development bank, and they were loaning people loans. And the folks they loaned money to were the folks that banks would not loan money to, and they were having very good results. One of them was on the Federal Reserve Bank Board, and he told the Federal Reserve Bank Board, he said, look, we should do an experiment. We do a large number of loans to folks who are, you know, precarious, and we see if they can handle those loans. And he convinced them. Then he came to me and he said, Melvin, I want $50 million to guarantee those loans. So if you have $50 million, he could generate $2 billion worth of loans and assume that those 50 million would be written off because that's the cost of those people who couldn't handle the loans. We said, okay, we'll do that, but here's what we want you to do. We want you to get an equivalent control group, and we want to compare. We want to know what makes these people able to deal with those loans. So we did this. So we had a social science experiment around it, and we did the 50 million. It generated not $2 billion worth of loans, but $4 billion worth of loans. 27% of the folks in the group of precarious homeowners, those were Black homeowners. In the control group, 3%. Female-headed households, 41%. In the control group, 16%. 41% in the self-help group, 16% in the control group. 49% of them were low income in the self-help group, 10% in the control group. This group went through, I think, about 8 years up until the Great Recession. And so we were able to see what kind of equity they had. Their equity was very strong. I'll get to the punchline, so I'm going to come back to the equity. But one of the things that we noticed was that we did have some late payments. They struggled, but guess what? They caught up. They would come back. They would come back. And then, of course, the housing market exploded and everyone was in trouble. But from this data, we know what makes it work. And here's what makes it work. You have to give people loans on a basis that does not put them in more difficulty than you should. In other words, stay away from all of those characteristics of those high-risk loans. Make them have some kind of down payment, even if it's small, okay? Make them have the same interest rate, not a lower interest rate. Don't do a low interest rate and then a balloon, okay? In other words, structure them so that they are consistent, they can stay on track, and give them, and this is a key, give them consumer education about home ownership. Not everyone knows that you got to put a little money away for those rainy days in which the pipes are going to break. Here's the thing that was troubling. When you looked at equity, Black households had 10% less equity. And that goes back to this larger issue. And that's the issue of segregation. As long as we have segregated housing markets, Blacks are going to have less equity. But it's a great study, and it actually proved to the economists that, yeah, you can get poor people into homes and they will stay there. Now, no one stays there when the housing market falls apart, but up until that time, they were very good homeowners.
Professor Shapiro, this follow-up questions for you. So you mentioned briefly a moment ago about solutions, the next steps in this important work. Could you tell us a little bit about Brandeis University's Institute of Assets and Social Policy, now the Institute of Economic Racial Equity, and some of the work that you're doing there?
Sure. So let me start with some of our more recent work. I had the honor of being asked by Senator Elizabeth Warren, who was then a candidate in the Democratic primary, to do some modeling and estimation on student debt forgiveness, student debt cancellation. And her team said, these are our parameters. Parameter one was that student debt cancellation policy has to cancel 75 to 80% of all student debt among X, Y, and Z demographic groups and higher educational institutions. And it needed to be explained on a stage in 3 sentences or less. That is, it had to be elegant and simple. And I came back to them and said, I'm interested in, on a volunteer basis, to put a team together to do some of this work on the condition that we will report out a policy design that closes the racial wealth gap at the same time as it cancels as much student debt as possible. And working with a lot of estimates, working with modeling, we were able to find what I call the sweet spot in a particular policy design. It happens to be the policy design that today Senator Schumer and Senator Warren have on the table in comparison to the President Biden's proposal of canceling $10,000. And I don't want to get into the weeds on that, particularly simply to say that once you think seriously about a racial wealth equity filter, you're able to think about and design policy solutions in a way that benefit the most people possible and that also close the racial wealth gap in the interim. I would add, President Oliver has talked a couple of times about the tax code. That is a weedy topic, but it is one where the most harm is being done, I believe, at the moment, and the Dorothy Brown book helps us get to that. There are proposals around baby bonds. I'm very personally, professionally, very much involved in children's savings account movement across the United States, active in many communities, and several states have plans now. California, where you are located, recently entered the field in a pretty big way, which we're very happy about. So there are a lot of solutions out there that deal with what I call both sides. Side number one, stop the harm. And side number two, the other side of that same coin, facilitate the generation and sustaining and building of financial assets among individuals and communities. And then finally, because I've been peeking at the chat a little bit, a question about reparations has come up. And I think that the case we make in Black wealth, white wealth, as Tasahai Coates and others have picked up, is part of the case for reparations. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's what we should look at for tomorrow. I think that that's a long-range struggle and challenge that might be worth directing ourselves to, but I think there are a lot of solutions between reparations and what we can do tomorrow.
Absolutely. So going back to the book a little bit, as we sit here today in 2021, do you have a new perspective? What do you know now that you didn't know when the book was first published in the 90s, and even when it was re-released 10 years after in the special anniversary edition?
I'm gonna let Tom answer this one first.
So I'll thank you. I'll start it off because I know we can have a great conversation about this. I'm sort of amazed that since the book came out, and we're talking, 1995 to today, seriously, the data, the facts have never been in question. The opponents, if you will, have never really questioned the data. It's always about the interpretation of the data, what caused the facts to say what they are, and that's a movement, if you will, in the kinds of conversations and narrative conversations we need to be engaging in the public square. I personally have a mantra: let no fact go unexplained, because if it's unexplained, somebody else will fill in the gap, and the fill in the gap will be their own implicit or explicit bias in a lot of cases. So I think we've learned that over the years. We don't know the answer yet on how to do it accurately, because it's as much art, I think, as it is science.
So the title of this talk includes the word progress. What progress do you think has been made? What's next? How do we close the racial wealth gap in America?
I'm going to come back to the other question for a minute. I do have something I want to say about it. One of the things I learned, and it was very humbling, very humbling. You're a professor, you do all this work, you have these great ideas, you figure, boy, this is so amazing. And I'm sure once people hear this, they're going to figure out that this is something we need to do. And, they'll find a way to get it done. And what I learned that was so humbling is making policy change is very, very tough. It is so difficult. The things that can happen that derail what you're trying to do, if you knew when you started, you just wouldn't start. I mean, it's just that tough. But sometimes serendipitous things happen and you get meaningful change when you weren't even looking for it. And so here's the perfect example. The current COVID bill that was just passed, it has the potential to make a revolutionary change by providing family support for children very similar to what European countries provide as a child allowance. If that's successful, it's going to cut child poverty rates 50%. You realize the last 4 years, nobody's been talking about that. And it was just this serendipitous thing that happened. And I saw that happen over and over again, where I thought I was next in line for the policy change. And something happens and I'm off the table and something else has happened. So that's one of the things I learned. And it's not to tell people not to do it. It's just that you have to grind it out, figure out your opportunity, but don't be upset if something else happens that you don't get what you want.
So let's shift gears a little bit. I think we might have some time for one or two questions that are popping up in the Q&A portal while we have you here. So one of the questions we have here says, how do you recommend people in poverty or low income build wealth, especially when a bank will not give them a loan because they don't already have family wealth built up?
So I will, it's a tough question. And, you really have to be humble before you give advice around that. And I try not to. I do think, as a general understanding, that if we're really talking about a family that's economically very precarious, the first order is to remove that precarity as much as possible around whatever benefits they can attain, around whatever paid work might be available, around help of family and friends and kinship and community. And I think that's the first order, frankly. Then we can start to think about emergency savings programs, so that the loss of several hours of work because there's a thunderstorm and you're told not to show up to work and lose half a day's pay, or there's a pandemic and your hours are cut back. So I think that next step is an emergency savings program, of which there are now several pilots in the United States, several demonstration programs around that all across the country. And then a whole bunch of other programs like children's savings accounts, individual development accounts, starting with the smaller steps, I think are really important building blocks.
I think there are two things you can do, and this is to echo Tom. There are a number of things that financial institutions are doing to help people save. And savings is not going to be the answer, but it's part of getting there. All of us have to create the kinds of habits that allow us to think about the future as opposed to just being oriented to what we get today. And so thinking about that extra cup of coffee that you get at, a nice $6 latte, think about that as opposed to $6 that you add to your monthly amount you're going to save means something. And if you go to an institution and ask, do you have a program for individual development accounts, you might be able to get that matched so you can have some more savings. Second, kids, we need to make sure kids have financial literacy. And getting your kid involved in financial literacy is an important thing. I grew up where banks were connected to elementary schools, and each of us had a passbook. And every Thursday we took our pennies in to generate savings. And the math lesson was, what is compound interest? Well, if you show some people who are, I probably would say at our school right now, and if you showed them, if you save this for how many years, how much would you have? They wouldn't be able to tell you. And compound interest is a very, powerful kind of mechanism. So we need to know about financial literacy. And it's going to be more and more important as society becomes more and more oriented around financial products. And some of those financial products are designed to take your money, not to have your money invested.
Honestly, listening to the two of you all day, I know for me this is a learning opportunity as well, but this has just been fantastic. On that note, I want to thank you both so much for this incredible and timely conversation. And thank you to our entire community of book club readers and to all of our Pitzer family for joining us this afternoon. We truly appreciate every opportunity we have to gather in one place together, even if it's virtual. But yes, please be on the lookout for future discussions and dates. And as I mentioned before, I hope all of you have a wonderful evening. And again, thank you so much, Professor Shapiro, for joining us. And as always, President Oliver, for having this conversation and this discussion this evening.
I want to say being in person is going to be coming soon. So looking forward to it.
Okay. And thank you for the opportunity, especially for bringing Melvin and I back together again. It's always a joy. And if any of my relatives, like a particular niece who's an alum of Pitzer, happens to be on the webinar, hello, Jenny.
Hello. Well, thank you both. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.